Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Carrie Anderson, production editor for TNSR. This episode of the podcast features a fascinating discussion with retired General Kenneth Frank McKenzie Jr., a former commander of U.S. Central Command, about his new book, The Melting Point: High Command and War in the 21st Century.
Well, good evening. I'm Joe Maguire. I'm the Executive Director of the Clements Center for National Security. And on behalf of the Clements Center and our co-sponsors, the Navy ROTC unit at the University of Texas and the LBJ School of Public Affairs, welcome. Thanks for joining us this evening in what I know will be a fabulous discussion of General McKenzie's new book, The Melting Point: High Command and War in the 21st Century. We're going to talk about the book, but to have the opportunity to have General McKenzie here, we're going to expand that and talk about a lot more than that. Ladies and gentlemen, reading General McKenzie's biography after 42 years in the United States Marine Corps would probably take up half the time that we have this evening. So I'll condense it just a little bit. He's currently the Executive Director of the University of South Florida's Global and National Security Institute. And Frank has commanded in his 42 years at every single level in the United States Marine Corps, to include combat in Afghanistan and also leading Marines in Iraq in 2005 and 6. Staff-wise, Frank held what I consider to be the most challenging and demanding position a three-star can have the United States government, and that is to be the Director of the Joint Staff. And on behalf of the University of Texas and all of us here, General McKenzie, thank you for being with us. We're honored to have you and welcome.
Thanks, Joe. Thank you.
Well, I've known the General for a while, and I know that he likes to write and he's very good at it. And The Melting Point is an excellent book. Don't take it from me, take it from the folks who wrote on the back, who we know, who are real luminaries. But it is really an easy read and it is extremely informative. But in it, you really connect policy and execution on the ground. Having served over 4 decades in war and in peace, I know that there are some things that you wanted to share in this book, and the book gave you the opportunity to do this. But first, let's start off with the title of the book. Would you tell us why you wrote The Melting Point?
Well, Joe, thanks. I'm delighted to be here, delighted to be at the University of Texas. My first time ever in Austin. I've been in Texas a lot, but never in Austin, and certainly never at the University of Texas. It's a great school. I've had a remarkable 24 hours. Just been a great experience. I wrote the book because I was a combatant commander. And let me tell you what that is. In the United States, there are 11 people that are combatant commanders, men and women, 4-star officers, and there are 7 geographic combatant commands, which means that you're responsible for a part of the earth. In my case, it was Central Command, which means I was responsible for U.S. military operations in the territory Egypt in the west, Pakistan in the east, Kazakhstan in the north to Yemen in the south, 21 countries. And after early 2021, included the state of Israel, which came into the Central Command region. So there are 7 of those, cover the whole world. And then there are 4 functional combatant commanders: Special Operations Command, Space Comm, Transportation Command, the people that move stuff around, and Cyber Command. But the unique thing about being a combatant commander is you're in the chain of command. That's sort of a unique thing, which meant when I was a combatant commander, there were only 2 people in the world that could tell me to do anything. One was the President of the United States. The other was the Secretary of Defense. Nobody else could give me an order to do anything. The chain of command is for a combatant commander, it's very short. Your boss is very clear, and the boss is not very far away. So if you look at, say, for example, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Senior Military Officer of the United States, by law, the Senior Military Advisor to the President and to the Secretary of Defense, he's not in the chain of command. He can't give an order. He can't cause a ship to sail, an airplane to take off, a bomb to drop, a missile to launch. Only a combatant commander has that kind of authority. So what that means is you're in a unique place when you're a combatant commander for a couple of reasons. First of all, you also are in a position to give advice. I've given advice to presidents, 2 of them directly. Sometimes my advice was taken, sometimes my advice was not taken. But after those sessions, the combatant commander is then the person who has to execute the policy decision that's made. So it gives you an opportunity to operate at the very highest levels of the United States, and in fact, the world, where you see the interaction of strategy, policy, statecraft, politics, practical military necessity. It all comes together there. You get to give your advice, and again, sometimes it's taken, sometimes it's not. But then when it's all said and done, you're the only person in the world that bridges the advice and the execution boundary. A lot of people give advice. The Undersecretary of Defense for Policy gives advice, and he's a very important person, or she is a very important person. But when it's all said and done, they're not responsible for execution. And so that's why I had a unique vantage for 3 years at U.S. Central Command, and the book is about my 3 years at U.S. Central Command. It's not the story of my life. It's about the time I was a combatant commander. You're in a unique position to watch decisions be made and then be responsible for those decisions as they're executed. And the title of the book, The Melting Point, actually is lifted from Barbara Tuchman's great book on the beginning of World War I. It's called The Guns of August. It's a great book. It's come under some attacks for accuracy in recent years, but I think she was what you'd call a popular historian, I guess. A lot of historians didn't like her because she wrote so well. But in her book, she talks about that melting point of warfare, the temperament of the individual commander. I was an individual commander at a time when I had to make significant decisions. During my time at Central Command, we struck and killed Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS. We struck and killed Qasem Soleimani, the leader of the Quds Force of the IRGC of Iran. We struck and killed Baghdadi's successor as the leader of ISIS. And I am the officer responsible for the withdrawal from Afghanistan and all that that implies. And I'm happy to talk about that as we get into this. Mm-hmm. And one thing before I go back to Joe, I would say I look forward to the questions, because for a 4-star officer, there's no inner monologue of inadequacy or self-doubt. So I'm happy to talk about anything you want to talk about. You're not going to put me off with a question. If I can answer it, I'll answer it. If I can't, I'll tell you I can't answer it. So I look forward to that dialogue. I actually think the dialogue is the most important part of the evening, and I look forward to that. Joe?
So, Frank, throughout the book, you talk about 3 threads that carry us from beginning to end. The first is about the importance of individual commanders and their leadership styles. The second covers the relationship between civilian leaderships and military leaders, referred to as civ-mil relationships. And the third, we've already touched on, the unique role of the combatant commander. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of the civilian control of the United States military?
So I think in our republic, here's the most important thing when you talk about civ-mil relations. The final decisions need to be made by civilian leadership. You never want to be in a situation where civilian leaders aren't in a position to make that decision. That's very important. And that's been a thread of the republic going back a couple hundred years. And I feel that it's very important. There's a lot of books written recently that concept is under attack. I disagree with that. I knew very clearly as a combatant commander who made the final decision. I'll put it like this. Any president, regardless of party, has the right to make a decision, and for it to be a wrong decision, a really wrong decision, and for that wrong decision to be executed by the U.S. military. You never want to be in a position where you got a 4-star that says, no, I'm not going to do that, except in one case, and that's an illegal order. So I know what an illegal order is. In 42 years, 10 months of service, I never got an illegal order. When I was at CENTCOM, I had 14 lawyers on my staff who were very happy to tell me what an illegal order was. But I know what an illegal order is. I never got one. But if the order is illegal, civilian authority, constitutionally appointed, constitutionally elected civilian authority, has every right to see a decision, right or wrong, executed by the military. And that's important. It's more important, actually, than the character of any single decision. The concept of civilian control overrides that. And so there were decisions I did not agree with during my time at Central Command. And I executed those decisions to the very best of my ability, because I believe the larger truth is, for the republic to flourish, civilians have to be in charge. You never want a situation to arise where a 4-star resigns because he doesn't want to do something. Because when a 4-star officer resigns, that is, no matter how you cast it, that is a political act. And the U.S. military needs to remain resolutely apolitical. Doesn't matter who the president is, the party's irrelevant. Any president has every right to expect his or her orders to be executed. So that's civ-mil relations in a nutshell. I've done a lot of thinking about it. And over time, I've written a bunch of letters of resignation because it's my release. I'm a good writer. I like writing. I like reviewing and admiring my letters of resignation. And then I put them in a drawer in my desk. I've got several of them. And but I never send them because it's not appropriate to do that.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you very much. So you were the CENTCOM commander from 2019 to 2022. So initially, you were in the Donald J. Trump administration, and then with Joseph Biden. Can you talk a little bit about civilian control and the transition of power from one president to the next, and what impact that had on you or the force. So, Frank, throughout the book, you talk about three threads that carry us from beginning to end. The first is about the importance of individual commanders and their leadership styles. The second covers the relationship between civilian leaderships and military leaders, referred to as civ-mil relationships. And the third, we've already touched on, the unique role of the combatant commander. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of the civilian control of the United States military?
Sure. So when presidential administrations change, and I had the good fortune back in 2007, 2008 as a brand new one-star general to lead the Joint Staff's presidential transition team when we went from the Bush administration to the Obama administration. So I'd had an opportunity to see up close how that needs to work. And here's the important thing. You want to serve the outgoing president until the president leaves, and then you want to make sure that you have engaged with the incoming president's team, because he'll have what they call beachhead teams that go to departments that sort of establish the new president and his team in those departments. They're going to ask a lot of questions. You want to be very candid and thoughtful with them. I've been very lucky in that in the case of the Biden administration, the beachhead leader was a woman named Christine Wormuth, who I know. She's been a former deputy secretary for policy. She's now the Secretary of the Army. I knew her personally. So it was easy to work with her. And so what you want to do is lay it out, but you want to be, the important thing the U.S. military needs to do is be completely apolitical in that process. There's actually a vignette that's important to me that sort of captures that, and it's this. In April 1945, Vice President Truman was in the basement of the Senate having a drink. He got a call that President Roosevelt had died in Warm Springs, Georgia. Come over to the White House. They're going to get sworn in. They swore him in. But here's the thing. Nobody wondered where the military was in that ceremony because the military's got nothing to do with it. It's a civilian event. Nobody said, where's George Marshall? We got to get George Marshall here. No, you don't. George Marshall's going to obey the orders of the President of the United States. It's not a military event. You don't need the military imprimatur on that ceremony to make it happen. Same thing when President Johnson, on very short notice, took the oath of office in a jet at Love Field in Dallas. Nobody wondered where the Joint Chiefs were. They did it on the jet with who they had right there. Nobody said, we got to get the chiefs on board. We got to find out what everybody. No, the U.S. military is an apolitical organization, and particularly in a transition of power, particularly when it's fraught, the military needs to be a loyal servant to whomever has the constitutional authority to be the President of the United States.
Thank you so much for that. So you are a distinguished alum from the Citadel class of 1979, where you graduated and were commissioned a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps as an infantry officer. You dedicate the book to two Citadel graduates. I wonder if you could talk about the lessons you learned at the Citadel and how you carried those lessons up to being a combatant commander.
Sure. So when I graduated in May of 1979, I know that's ancient history to most of you in this room. First of all, nobody thought I'd ever be a general. Many people were probably not certain I was ever going to be a captain. I didn't think so. I had no idea. I was an indifferent student at the Citadel. I was a 4-year English major. I know I wanted to major in English because that's what interested me. I didn't bail to English from a harder major, as a few people do at the Citadel. I was a 4-year English major, and my major courses, very good. I enjoyed it. I found I could write quickly and easily and enjoyed it. But I was also fascinated with the Marine Corps and knew that's what I wanted to do. My family has no particular military tradition. I'm from Birmingham, Alabama originally, but something clicked. I found that I enjoyed the physical challenge. I enjoyed the mental challenge. I enjoyed working with people. And the Marine Corps is a people organization. It's not an equipment organization. Mm-hmm. As a second lieutenant, you're in charge of 40 young men in 1980 when I met my first rifle platoon. So you've got to like people. You've got to enjoy interacting with people. I always found that to be the case. And as I got older, got more challenging assignments, you broaden, you find you can do other things. And you find that you like the challenges that's presented by the organization, the broadening opportunities that you get. And that's what worked for me. I will fast forward to 1999. I had 20 years of active duty. I had just come back from commanding an infantry battalion, which is sort of the culminating event for a mid-grade Marine officer. Had a very successful command tour coming back from the Mediterranean where we'd been deployed. And at that point, the only time I ever thought about getting out of the Marine Corps, I thought really hard about getting out and pursuing a doctorate in history. I really wanted to do that. And I talked to my wife, and I didn't do it ultimately, but I thought that's the only time I ever really thought about getting out, really up until the time I left active duty at 42 years and 10 months of service. But what happened then was I was going to the National War College, great assignment, happy to do that in Washington. And they called me up and said, the officer of the Commandant called me up and said, look, we're going to change your orders. You're going to go to the National Defense University and be a fellow, and you're going to work for a woman named Michelle Flournoy. Some of you may know Michelle Flournoy. She's the former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. She's the smartest human being I've ever been around in the flesh. And I worked for her for 18 months. And it was a broadening opportunity for me. It allowed me to see beyond the tactical things. It allowed me to begin to weave in policy considerations, strategy considerations beyond the Marine Corps. And what that did then was, I'll go back to what you asked at the beginning. When I was a cadet at the Citadel, a guy named Bill Gordon, who was a professor of history at the Citadel, a reserve Marine officer. The time he was a reserve captain, he retired as a reserve colonel. He was a Theodore Ropp trained military historian, came out of Duke University with his PhD from Duke. But I was taking a test, and his question was, it was about anti-submarine warfare in the Northern Atlantic in the early stages of the Second World War. And the question was not only about what was going on in the North Atlantic, but the task was to examine the institutional impacts and what actually shaped what happened then. And that question opened my mind to begin to think beyond the immediate, but rather to think about all the things that go into what actually happens on a battlefield or in a battle space or at sea in this case. And so I dedicated the book to him for that. He's been very close to me for many years ever since. He's close to me today. He's now a retired professor living outside of Culpeper, Virginia. And the other guy was a guy named Walt Clark, class of 51, who was Commandant of Cadets when I was there. He was just very important to me. He was an Army officer. He was a hard-bitten infantry colonel. But he told a lot of stories, and he imbued me with the desire to be an infantryman. Even though I wasn't an Army infantryman, I was a Marine. But those two officers had a profound effect on me. And they go back to, it is a people organization. I've had the opportunity to mentor other people. I hope I've been as helpful to them as many people have been to me, because you really do need to pay it back. That was always important to me in my career up until even now. I'm still involved in that process.
Well, I'm sure that they're very honored by that, Frank. Thanks for sharing that. You talk about leadership. You discuss the importance of knowing your subordinates. As a combatant commander, what were the qualities that you were looking for in your leaders?
So as a combatant commander, think of it like this, in a business sense, I had 9 direct reports. Those were all generally lieutenant generals or vice admirals. My air component commander who commanded 8th Air Force. My RCENT commander who commanded 3rd Army, Patton's Army in World War II. All these 3 stars. And that's who you primarily interact with. So let me tell you, it's a lot easier to talk to, as a battalion commander, to talk to 1,000 young Marines in a battalion gathering than to sit down at a table and talk to 9 3-stars. Because they come to you with 30 years of experience, culture, strategic baggage, all kinds of things. And my approach to leadership is I am a communicator. And I'm actually, transactional leadership has gotten a bad name. But I think one of the things you got to sell if you're going to be a leader of a large organization is you got to say, look, here's what I'm going to do. We're going to have a good plan. I'll get us a good plan to do the mission and to give us the maximum chance of all surviving the mission. Because it's not about dying. It's about doing the mission and coming home. And I'll give you that plan. What I need from you is your willing cooperation. What I need from you is your aggressive support of this. And the American fighting man or woman isn't going to do that unless it's explained to them. It's not new to your generation. It goes back to the Second World War. Americans fight best when they know why they're fighting. And you got to take pains to explain that. Many people believe the U.S. military is an organization where people just give orders and stuff happens. Actually, that's not the case. You do that and you're going to have a poorly performing military organization. You got to tell people why, particularly if you're asking them to risk their life. They have a right to know why you want them to do it. And so I have always tried very hard at every level of command to give that sense to people. Here's what we're going to do. Here's why we're going to do it. My plan's a good plan. If you got a better idea, let's talk about it. At some point, we're going to make a decision and we're going to execute. Now the time for arguing is over. We're going to go and do our business. But you want to make sure everybody gets an opportunity to buy in. The other side of that equation is anytime at Central Command when I had to give difficult orders, and I had to do that a lot, the traditional view of a military organization is a pyramid. Commander alone at the top, few people below him, then increasing echelons as you go down till you get to the people actually in contact with the enemy, a lot of people at the bottom. I like to turn that over. At Central Command, at the top, there were a lot of people around me giving me advice. The 14 lawyers I've talked about, my staff, separate from the 9 subordinate commanders that I talked about, but a brilliant, driven staff of highly aggressive, highly ambitious, very good 2-stars typically, who gave me advice. But as you go down till you finally get to the man or woman who's in contact with the enemy, ultimately that person's alone. And you need to remember that when you give orders. The battlefield is a very lonely place, whether you're in a single-seat aircraft, you're in a submarine, you're on an aircraft carrier, or you're in a 2-man fighting position. The battlefield is extremely lonely. And finally, my experience is as an infantryman, there's nothing between you and the enemy but your shirt. And that's a very, very lonely feeling. And so my job was to make sure that man or woman had what they needed to do to accomplish the task. And that helped me as a mental model when I had to give difficult orders. And as I said before, I've given a lot of difficult orders.
You quote Clausewitz saying that habits breed a priceless calm. Is that the one thing you noted with many of your commanders, that they remained calm under pressure?
When things are bad and you're in command, you want to be the calmest person in the room. People look to you. And so it's not, for me, that was not a habit that came to me naturally. My habits as a commander, as a 4-star, were very different than my habits as a lieutenant colonel. I was a lot more demonstrative, aggressive, which is what the Marine Corps wants in its lieutenant colonel commanders. But as a more senior commander, you got to be calm, you got to be steady. And you're the person who has to think beyond the immediate. I got great people to do the immediate job. I'm the person who has to have the answer for what if it goes wrong, or what if it goes right? What are we going to do next? And people that sense of calm, and you can even do it in a VTC environment. At CENTCOM, typically in a major combat operation, I'm sitting in Tampa in a dark room at the head of what we call the killer U. It's a big U-shaped table. I'm at the head of the U, surrounded by lawyers behind me, my operations officers, my intelligence officer, all kinds of other specialists. Then down at the end of the room, there are huge screens. One's normally a big map. The other one's what we call the Hollywood squares. All my commanders. And so we call it the bridge. The bridge is open so we can exchange information at a very high level of classification. But they can see me and I can see them. They're watching my body language. And so I'm very conscious of my body language when I'm in meetings like that, because most of them are forward, and so they're actually in harm's way. I'm not in harm's way in Tampa, but they're in harm's way. And I'm very mindful of the difference in where I am and where they are. But calmness, I've grown to appreciate the value of being calm increasingly as I've gotten older. You want to be calm, you want to be steady. And the other thing I would say is the ability to get bad news. So nobody likes to give the boss bad news. And George Gordon Meade, the commander of the Army of the Potomac in the American Civil War, he turned irascible and often sometimes near violent when his subordinates gave him bad news. As a result of that, Sam Grant, when he became the general officer commanding the nation's armies, actually put his headquarters with Meade so he could watch him and coach him. If you're the commander and people are afraid to give you bad news, they're still going to give you bad news because they got to tell you, but they will shade it because nobody likes to be hit in the face, figuratively, when you go in to see the boss. So what you need as a commander, though, is you need the absolute truth. So you got to be flat when you get bad news. I would tell people this. As a younger guy, I was the military secretary to the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and I was the director of the Joint Staff. There's no bad news you can give me about human behavior that I haven't heard before. What people do to each other, there's nothing you can tell me I haven't heard before. At the same time, you got to be careful about that, because I'll tell you something else. In my career, I've worked for people who said, look, I'm a great guy. You're going to like working for me. Unfailingly, they turned out to be assholes. I'm just being candid with you.
That's the technical term.
That's the technical term. So I never say that to people when they join me. I say, look, here's my organization. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to accomplish the mission because that's why we're here. And that's going to put people at risk. But you've got to be receptive to information. And you got to work at that, because you can't just say it. Because particularly as a 4-star commander, but at levels below that, everybody watches everything you do because you control their lives. You can get them all killed with a boneheaded decision. They know that. So you got to be conscious. If you suddenly lash out and go nuts over something, that's damage that can't be undone. By the time I was a 4-star, I was very good at controlling that. When I was a lieutenant colonel, it was a lot harder for me to control that. There are probably people that were able to control it as a lieutenant colonel. I had to work at it. But by the time I went to CENTCOM, and even before that, I was pretty good at controlling it. If you're the director of the Joint Staff for 2 years, you learn to control yourself in the face of really hideously bad information.
So, Frank, you also quote someone you hold in high regard, the leader who influenced your style and command, British Field Marshal Slim. And the quote is, the key ability to communicate energy with affection. What is it about Field Marshal Slim's leadership that influenced you so much?
So Bill Slim was a British general, later field marshal. He fought in the China-Burma-India theater in World War II. It was way out there. Nobody knew anything about it. They got the ragged end of equipment. 1941, 42, he's beaten badly by the Japanese and has to retreat all the way really to India. Then he comes back and he destroys the Japanese, 43, 44, 45, in a brilliant campaign. He wrote a book about it called Defeat into Victory, which I could not recommend more strongly. And don't read the abridged version, get the long version. And but he fascinated me because of his ability to persevere in the face of unremitting disaster, just to be there, and his ability to manage people. And so affection with energy. So here's the thing, if you're going to be in command, and when I was in command, I preferred to have a good relationship with my subordinates. Everybody knows who's in charge. I don't have to tell them that. They know who's in charge. But what you want to do is you don't want to, and also with your peer commanders. Remember, as a combatant commander, I had 10 peers. You'd be surprised how often we disagreed on things. And with the Joint Chiefs, you don't want to burn a bridge over an issue, because the next day you're unfailingly going to need to go back to that person and repair that bridge and do business. So you try to keep those links open. You want to be collegial in these discussions. But when it's all said and done, they got to do what you want them to do. And they know that. And that's the communication of energy. But they also have a right to expect that their voices are going to be heard, and you're going to be concerned about whether they succeed or fail and how their people do. That's affection with energy, and I don't think anybody has ever said it or practiced it better than Field Marshal Slim. I would argue the great British commander of the Second World War, but because he fought in CBI, Montgomery gets all the credit, and Montgomery's a very good commander in a lot of ways. But I think Bill Slim is worthy of study, and I often go back and read about Bill Slim because he's a great guy, and he's a good writer. He wrote a good book, and he wrote it himself. I got a lot of time for generals that write their own books.
In the book, you say that there are 3 memorable moments in your life: the assassination of President Kennedy, 9/11, and the time that you received the order to withdraw from Afghanistan. 2 of the 3 directly involve Afghanistan. Frank, can you tell us about the last 2 in depth?
So on 9/11, I was a brand new colonel. I was actually what we call a frock colonel. I wasn't even being paid as a colonel. I was just wearing the Eagles, and I was executive assistant to the operations deputy of the Marine Corps, the chief opso of the U.S. Marine Corps, a guy named Buck Bedard, a 3-star general and a great guy. And we were in his office up on the 5th, because it was the Marine Corps. We had the worst offices in the building, up on the 5th deck, all the way in on the A ring. So as a rule in the Pentagon, you want to be low and out. E ring best, all the way out, and on the 1st or 2nd deck. We were 5th and A, all the way in and all the way up. And we were prepping him to go to Mexico for an event. I was his EA, which means I basically made sure the trains ran on time. We were doing a briefing, and I got a call, and so he's in a room, little briefing room right across from our offices. And I get a call from the military secretary of the commandant, a job I had later, who's sort of the commandant's EA. He says, "Hey, Frank, an airplane just flew into the World Trade Center." I said, "That's nothing," because I remembered actually in 45 or 46, an A-26 flew into the Empire State Building, into the Catholic War Relief offices. So there's precedent for airplanes flying into skyscrapers in New York. Didn't think anything of it. And so we go back into the briefing, and then our political advisor, who's a Department of State officer, runs into the room wild-eyed and says, "Another airplane just hit a building hit the World Trade Center." So Bedard looks at me, and he gives me a look that I knew. He said, "Go out and investigate, including the possibility that the Polad's gone nuts." And so I go out, and sure enough, another airplane hit the building. So we get General Bedard out. We're talking to our command center, which is not in the Pentagon. It's actually in another location. And a buddy of mine, a good friend of mine, who was the current operations officer of the Marine Corps, said, "There's an airplane inbound. It's about a minute out. They're launching fighters. They're not going to get there. You're fixing to get hit." So gave General Bedard the phone, tells him that. Big boom. Didn't knock anybody over. But I said one of the most brilliant things I've ever said. I said, "General, I believe an airplane just hit the building." So then we walk across the A-ring to look across the courtyard. Huge billowing fireball. We were about as far away as you could be in the building and still be in the building. So we were never in any kind of danger at all. We stayed for about 3 hours working because the communications were up. The commandant of the Marine Corps was at a funeral, got clobbered in traffic, could not get back to the building. And my boss did a lot of great things. It's where I watched a calm guy at work. As the Marine Corps prepared to go to war, he calmed everybody down at all the bases around the Marine Corps, the fighting organizations of the Marine Corps. And then we went up and fell in, and for the next 2 months, we worked very hard at that, at another location outside the Pentagon while they repaired the Pentagon. So I was there at the beginning, and that has stuck with me forever because I'll remember a couple of things. It was one of the most beautiful days I ever remember in Washington. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. It was like 70 degrees. It was perfect. And when we left to drive away from the Pentagon to go up to Henderson Hall, which is right next to it where the headquarters was, there are no airplanes in the sky because there's always jets flying over the Pentagon into Reagan. They're all gone. In fact, eventually you could see an F-16 up there doing lazy eights up over the city. And that was it. There was nothing else. I'll just never, ever forget that day and the rare beauty of that day. So fast forward, it's mid-April 2021. I am the CENTCOM commander. President Biden is our president. Let me just back up one second, give them a little bit of context for this. People ask me all the time, so what happened in August 2021? Why was it so bad? I could give you 100 reasons, but I'm going to narrow it down a little bit. I'm going to tell you 2 U.S. presidents, as unalike as any 2 U.S. presidents in our history, President Trump and President Biden, shared one single policy objective in common. They wanted to leave Afghanistan regardless of consequences. In no other area of their administration was there agreement about anything, but there was complete agreement about getting out of Afghanistan. Began with President Trump. We negotiated the Doha Agreement with the Taliban in February of 2020. Our negotiator was a guy named Zalmay Khalilzad. He's a U.S. ambassador. We signed an agreement with the Taliban, not the government of Afghanistan. We left them out, but we signed an agreement with the Taliban where we were going to leave and do a number of things, including draw down our forces by May of 2021 and leave. The Taliban obligated themselves to do 7 things. One thing they did immediately, they stopped attacking us. The other 6 things they did not do. They continued to do, I should say. And that was redouble their attacks on the government of Afghanistan. They never talked to the government of Afghanistan in a meaningful way to try to find a way forward. And they did not undertake to prevent Al-Qaeda and ISIS-K from using Afghanistan as a base for external operations against the United States. We had conditions in that agreement. If you guys aren't doing it, we're going to stop. We never called them to task on that. We operated like we were on a train schedule. And the Taliban saw that and adapted their tactics accordingly. So I had argued at that time, at the very beginning, I said, if we go to 0 in Afghanistan, the government of Afghanistan is going to collapse. They are not going to be able to sustain themselves. Why is that important to us? It's important to me as the military commander, but not for social reasons, although there are profound reasons why, socially, why we should be interested in what happens in Afghanistan, the current treatment of women, human rights record of the Taliban, significant problems for us all. But my problem was more specific. I didn't want Al-Qaeda and ISIS to be able to gather strength and attack us again. So that was my reason for wanting to keep a presence in Afghanistan. So I had argued with President Biden, and so President Trump left office. Well, the election in November 2020, we were at 4,500 U.S. forces in Afghanistan and about 5,000 NATO forces in Afghanistan, because there are actually more NATO soldiers in Afghanistan than U.S. soldiers. Many people don't realize that. President Trump, after the election, fired the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Esper, and issued an order that we're going to go to 2,500 by January 21st, the day that President Biden would be sworn in. So, okay, I felt at 2,500 we could actually hang on in Afghanistan. The 4-star who worked for me, a guy named Scott Miller, felt that, and so did the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley. That was our consistent opinion. At 2,500, we can still help our CIA partners do the CT work they need to do against Al-Qaeda. We can still operate against ISIS. It won't be pretty, but the government of Afghanistan can hold on. That was my advice. I gave that advice a couple of times to the president. He listened to me, which I appreciated, because the president doesn't have to hear that advice, but he heard the advice. But then mid-April, I'm sitting in my jet, taking off to go to Washington to run a course for up-and-coming 3-stars, and they say, hey, the secretary wants to talk to you. I knew then it's never good news when that happens. And so it was a Gulfstream airplane, which is a great airplane, but the phones on it don't work well when you're in the air. I have another airplane that I use when I go into the theater, but it's a short trip. So I held him up on the runway, and Secretary Austin came on. And he said, look, we're going to go to 0. And I said, I got it. We had a plan to do that, and we executed that plan. But here's the fatal flaw. Our plan was, and the plan that we prepared was to withdraw all military forces from Afghanistan. We executed that plan, I would say, remarkably smoothly. And by 12 July, when I turned over with Scott Miller and he went home, I became the last commander in Afghanistan, not of the International Security Assistance Force, or RSM, but of the U.S. forces Afghanistan, because NATO was gone by then. What we did not do at the same time was we did not begin to bring out our embassy in April. In April, there were 4,000 people in that embassy, largest embassy in the world. We didn't bring them out. We didn't bring out the tens of thousands of U.S. citizens, most of them dual citizenship people that were there in Afghanistan. And we did not begin to bring out the hundreds of thousands of at-risk Afghans who had fought with us, who had been our interpreters, who had fought alongside us in this long, bloody war. So we did not do, and we had a special immigrant visa program that brought people back at a trickle, and the word glacial would be to overstate its speed. So we're drawing down, coming out, everything's going fine. Cities begin to fall as our support for Afghanistan military goes away. We no longer have mechanics on the ground to help them with their airplanes. We can't help them as they move logistics around. We can't give them advice anymore because we are gone. So the Afghans begin to crumble, as we had predicted. So what happens is to actually declare that you're going to bring an embassy out of a country and you're going to require your citizens to leave. It requires a decision by the Department of State. That is not a Department of Defense decision. It's a jealously guarded prerogative. I participated in, or as a Marine, you do a lot of what we call NEOs, non-combatant evacuation operations. No ambassador likes to declare it. No Secretary of State likes to declare it. We declared a NEO in Afghanistan, began to bring the embassy out, began to bring our people out on 15 August. Think about it. So what you saw in the days following was a direct result of waiting until we were actually beyond in extremis to bring these people out. Should have been doing it in April. Now, here's the thing, and this is a reasonable argument that a person might make. Well, if you'd begun to bring the embassy out in April, if you'd begun to bring American citizens out in April, and if you'd begun to bring at-risk Afghans out in April, would that not have hastened the collapse of Afghanistan? I don't know. That's a counterfactual. Let the historians argue about that. They'll be doing it for decades. I don't know the answer to that. I do know the answer, though, to what happens if you delay, because that's not a matter of conjecture. That's a matter of historical record. I would ascribe the decision to, depending on your perspective, American arrogance or American exceptionalism. The belief that, well, we can actually declare defeat, leave the battlefield, and still dictate policy. No, you can't. The Taliban won. They get to dictate policy because we left. And the laws, and so it's a belief that sometimes people don't understand that the laws of history actually operate even against the United States. And they certainly did in Afghanistan. And that's what led us to those final ugly, bloody, disastrous moments in mid and late August. Every time we got there, Jeff.
Well, Frank, the Melting Point's cover photograph was taken at Kabul airport on the 17th of August and during the withdrawal from Afghanistan. But I think that, for me, the intensity of the situation is reflected in your face.
So I was there, 17 August. In this picture, I'm actually walking up to North Gate. I was not happy. That would be a profound understatement.
It comes across loud and clear.
I was not happy in that picture. But I went up there and watched Marines and sailors process Afghans at North Gate. And I would tell you, it was, in all my life, that's probably one of the moving moments. It's up there with probably those other three. Because what you got there are young Marines and sailors. It's an environment where people are screaming, babies are screaming, people are gesticulating, trying to get your attention to get in. And you've got to search these people. Because we're going to put them on an airplane. We're not going to put anybody on an airplane that hadn't been searched. We're not going to take the risk of blowing an airplane up and killing 300 or 400 people. So you got to search them. You got to have their breath on you and your breath on them. And that is an act of astonishing intensity and courage because these people are searching 8, 10-hour shifts under threat of direct attack all the time. I say in the book, and I mean it, it was really the greatness of the American spirit operating there. Whatever you think of the decision to stay or leave and how it was executed, the young men and women that were up there executing that task, and I mean, you're standing water bottles everywhere, opened MREs everywhere, halal meal MREs everywhere, human filth on the ground, people just, the intensity and din of the noise. And these Marines and sailors are very, very calm. They're it was a remarkable episode in American arms. Now, unfortunately, it's deeply politicized now, but that's what I saw on that day. And it didn't make the day any better, but I felt I'd been exposed to something unique and something uniquely American that day.
Thank you, Frank. But let's talk specifically just about the Abu Gate. There is a scene that you paint in the book, and I think it sums up absolutely beautifully when you say it was here at this small entrance that the U.S. policy, politics, and national decisions and the eventual outcome of those decisions became human reality. And you talk about the crush of people you just did, trying to get into the airport, hopefully to get a path out, the people who had travel documents that couldn't even get to the front of the line to get out of the airfield, people waiting for days and days in line. And then you talk about the Marines who were guarding those various choke points. And you say, to do the job they were doing, for hours at a time, exposed to potential attack at any time, required persistent courage, the hardest kind of courage, and it humbled me. You say that I knew that I was in the presence of the American spirit in that dirty, walled entry point. Can you tell us about that personally and how you felt?
Yeah. So it's a unique experience to see it. It goes on, we're running 24-hour operations. Marines are out there 8, 10, 12 hours. Soldiers are out there 8, 10, 12 hours. Sailors, airmen. It's a very difficult environment. And here's the thing. If you want to defend yourself, you can do it. But we weren't there to defend ourselves. We were there to evacuate people. And if you're going to evacuate people, you got to bring people in. You got to get close to people. And that's what makes you vulnerable. We could have prevented the Abbey Gate attack had we stopped bringing people in. The day of the Abbey Gate attack, 26 August 2021, 13,300 people flew out of Afghanistan that day. We also prevented a number of other attacks. The Abbey Gates attack, one that got through. I'll certainly regret that for the rest of my life. But I also regret the 2,450 odd other Americans that died over the 21-year period of that war leading up to the Abbey Gate attack. No one's death is any more valuable than anybody else's death, to include the Afghans that died in that conflict. The many, many countless Afghans that died in that conflict. It was a tough day. I was actually talking to the president when the attack occurred. During these days, I would spend, the middle of my mornings, I would spend between 2 and 3 hours with the president in a large Hollywood squares, just going over what was going on with the cabinet. Secretary of State's there, Secretary of Defense is there, all the National Security Advisors there. And so my day was filled with those kinds of discussions. A civets early in the morning with the secretary, midday with the president, late in the day again with the secretary. So what my job was then was to prevent distractions from Washington filtering down to the commanders on the ground. I did that imperfectly because of the ubiquity of communications. Everybody that had a cell phone was calling to try to get people out, and I understand that. If I'd been in that circumstance, I'm certain I would have been doing the same thing. But it was a very difficult day, particularly for the commanders on the ground who were actually dealing with the problem. The one point I would just emphasize is we lost 13 Americans at Abbey Gate. There were probably 10 or 15 attacks we prevented. And really, from a cold-blooded military point of view, what's remarkable is not the Abbey Gate attack, but the fact that there was just one attack. And we should remember that sometimes. The guys on the ground did a pretty good job, and they prevented a number of other opportunities for other significant casualties to occur. In no way minimizes what happened at Abbey Gate, because I wish we'd gotten out with 0 casualties. But the fact of the matter is, if you choose to employ military force, it is a blunt instrument. And often, people are going to die as a result of that, and they certainly did at Abbey Gate.
Thank you. So let's go back a little bit. You're back in Washington, D.C., and one of the things you describe in the book is how you spent time by yourself in the cabinet in the West Wing. And it gets to this wonderful moment, and you get to reflect, and this speaks how wonderfully you write, Frank. And you say, the history of our republic, measured in decades, was palpable. It was easy to imagine President John F. Kennedy across the table dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis, or President Johnson grappling with the Vietnam War, a war that he did not want and could not get rid of. Can you tell us a little bit about how you ended up in the cabinet room alone and what that meant to you?
So on 3 June 2020, 2 days after the Lafayette Square walk by President Trump, you'll recall, I had to go up and brief President Trump on a withdrawal plan from Afghanistan. We had prepared it. I'm the commander, my job to brief it. I flew up there, met with General Milley and Secretary Esper, drove across to the White House. And you may or may not recall, that morning, Secretary Esper had done a press conference where he said he regretted walking across with the president to Lafayette Square. So we all go over there, and this is we're in COVID right now. So you go over to the old executive office building, get in line. So I'm between actually Attorney General Barr and the Secretary of State, getting my nose swabbed. And then we all troop over to the Oval Office. I'm going to do the briefing. And so you stand in the anteroom right outside, all these guys, and General Milley and me, and they're going in to see the president. And one of the president's assistants says, "No, General McKenzie, you don't need to go in for that. You're going to go, why don't you go sit in the cabinet room?" So there's the Oval Office, an aide's office, and then the cabinet room. And so I went and sat in the cabinet room. I was alone in the cabinet room. And I'll tell you, you can do a lot of thinking when you're alone in the cabinet room for an hour and 15 minutes or so. First of all, there's the bust of Benjamin Franklin and George Washington wearing togas, which is a little strange, and some fantastic art there. And it's worth going to the website, just looking at the pictures in that room. But you can do a lot of thinking about American history and where we're in American history that day and why we were there, what I was there to talk about. And I was wondering what they were talking about next door. We know what they were talking about next door. President Trump was smashing up his Secretary of Defense for going on TV that morning. And Secretary Esper talks about it in his book, and I couldn't improve on how he described it. But I sat there for quite a while, reviewed my notes, thought about what I was going to say, looked at the pictures, and it was deathly quiet in there. It's cool, it's quiet, it's a calmness in the middle of, a city that's in some trauma right then. And after that, they come out and grab me. We go down to the sit room, and I actually briefed the president on the Afghan withdrawal plan. But it was a profound moment for me, because you can sort of place, what little tiny role I had in American history in context when you got time alone. I've been in that room before, but I'd always been in the room with all the other combatant commanders where we sit around the table, the president's in the middle, they take pictures, the president asks a couple of pro forma questions, press comes in, and then you go do something else, but never in a substantive way. So it was a remarkable moment for me. It's something that'll stay with me forever.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Frank. A little bit earlier, you mentioned about the operation for General Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force and the IRGC. What impact did that operation have on the behavior of the Iranians after that operation?
We struck and killed Qasem Soleimani on the night of 2-3 January 2020. I'm the responsible officer for that operation. President made the decision. It's a presidential decision. I'm the guy that was responsible for executing it with our special operations forces and other elements of the joint force. I supported that decision. I recommended that decision. And here's why I recommended it. That night, Qasem Soleimani was flying into Iraq to coordinate further attacks on our embassy, which had been under significant attack for the 2 or 3 days prior, and to conduct other attacks across the region. He wasn't going to run up to the embassy wall with a satchel charge himself. I don't mean to imply that, but he was going to coordinate the actions of others that were going to do that. So my view was the risk of inaction, letting him go on, was greater than the risk of action. There were risks attendant to action, striking it. And there were significant risks attendant to that. But I felt those risks were manageable, reasonable. I had the opportunity to state what I felt those risks were, that Iran would expand, that Iran might lash back out, and they did. And I can talk about that in just a minute. But I felt nonetheless the impact it would have on, first of all, it was a tactical decision. We wanted to prevent him from killing Americans in the immediate future. Certainly there was a strategic consideration, but we didn't make that decision thinking about where Iran would be 4 or 5 years after that. Although I have to tell you, I've done a great deal of thinking about that. I thought about Qasem Soleimani since I was the director of the Joint Staff. He had always interested me, even going back further, when I was as a 2-star, I was General Mattis's, when he was the CENTCOM commander, I was his strategic planner as a regional J5 before I became the Joint Staff J5 and then the director. So I'd studied Qasem Soleimani, and I felt he was a key figure for the Iranians because he could operate outside the Iranian command and control system. So the Iranians actually have a military command and control system. They got a Joint Chiefs of Staff, they got a chairman, they've got an Army, Navy, Marine Corps, sort of. And then outside that, you have the IRGC, the Islamic Republican Guard Corps, and then its elite, the Quds Force. They operate completely outside Iranian normal military, the Artesh is what we would call it, or normal Iranian command and control. And inside the Quds Force, Soleimani commanded it. He had a familial relationship with the Supreme Leader, Khomeini. He could go to him directly on anything and generally speaking, get his way on that. He was an effective leader. He was very good at going into Iraq, knocking heads together, getting everybody to do what the Iranians wanted. And his loss has created a problem for him they have not filled to this day. But actually, I would refer you to the remarks of then Foreign Minister Zarif, Iranian foreign minister, who made the mistake of recording an oral history that, of course, was leaked and was published in the New York Times. And in that, he says the loss of Soleimani, he was irreplaceable. It's like losing a major city in Iran. We have not been able to recover from it. He was a unique personality, and I believe that it had profound effects on them, effects that persist to this day to some degree. They're not as effective as they would otherwise be in their proxy operations across the region. I always regret the loss of life, but I believe more people are alive now than would be alive if Qasem Soleimani had lived that night. I didn't lose any sleep over it that night. I haven't lost a moment of sleep over it any night since. I'm comfortable with that decision. I don't mean to say it was an easy decision, and I don't mean to minimize it, because we didn't just kill him. We killed Mohandas, an important Shia militant leader, and we killed his bodyguard too. So probably 8 or 9 people died in that strike. But for me, at least, I'll just close with this on this particular subject. The fitting thing was we killed Qasem Soleimani on every road in Baghdad and in Iraq's got a code name. The road from the airport to the center of the city is called Route Irish. On Route Irish, Qasem Soleimani was probably directly responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans. Directly responsible during our drawdown in 2008, 9, 10, when he introduced explosively formed penetrators into Iraq. So Didn't bother me a bit. I'm just being candid with you.
So, Frank, General Soleimani, more so than anybody in Iran, was responsible for establishing the proxies in the region. Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. Hamas is in the news. We're all familiar with that in Gaza. Hezbollah in Lebanon. But the Houthis, they're the ones that in Yemen are firing missiles and drones at our ships in the sea. What is it about the Houthis, or why are the Houthis, more so than other folks, most ardent supporters of Hamas?
Here's a fact that many people don't realize. Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah are not particular friends of Hamas. They like what Hamas is doing. They applaud the objectives that Hamas is seeking, the destruction of the state of Israel, because they both pursue those objectives, but they're not particularly close. And really what's interesting about what's happened in the region since October of last year is the fact that Iran has not come in heavy to support the Houthis, and Lebanese Hezbollah has not come in heavy to support the Houthis. Now, here's the thing about Iran. Iran has a limited ability to hurt Israel with conventional forces. They tried on 13 April, big missile drone, land attack, cruise missile attack. It didn't go well for the Iranians. And it was a major attack. It wasn't an attempt to signal, as some people have said. It was designed to take out Nevatim Airfield, which is a big Israeli air base, where they believe, rightly or wrongly, that's where the strike was launched that killed IRGC planners up in Damascus, Syria. They struck, they failed. They failed for three reasons. The Israelis are pretty good at defending themselves. The United States helped Israel defend themselves, and the Arab nations, the Arab neighbors of Israel, helped Israel defend itself. That's important. So Iran's ability to directly support the Houthis, and that attack didn't occur because they were supporting the Houthis. The Iranian attack occurred because for the past 2 or 3 years, they had been outfought by the Israelis in these proxy wars around the region, culminating in that 1 April strike in Damascus. That's why the Iranians launched the attack. It had nothing to do with the Houthis. Now, so their ability to hurt Israel is fairly limited. We can come back and talk about that later if anyone wants to follow up on it. But who can hurt Israel is Lebanese Hezbollah, largest non-state military entity in the world, tens and tens and tens of thousands of missiles, over 100,000 that can be fired into Israel, some of great accuracy and great range. They could put 200 missiles an hour, in my judgment, in downtown Tel Aviv if they chose to do it. Now, the Israelis will intercept most of those missiles, but they won't intercept all of those missiles. But they can hurt Israel. And the guy that runs Lebanese Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, is actually a pretty astute strategist. And Lebanese Hezbollah won't come into the fight against Israel unless they see there's an opportunity for a strategic victory. Nothing, let me emphasize this, nothing that happens in Gaza will influence that decision. Because from a strategic point of view, they applaud the objectives, but they don't care. They're not going to come in to support Hamas in this fight. They'll come in if they see an opportunity to destroy Israel. That opportunity doesn't exist because Israel remains too strong for them to do it. They could hurt Israel very badly, but Hassan Nasrallah also knows Israel can hurt him very badly. In 1982, there were Israeli tanks in downtown Beirut. The Israelis can go back up there again if they choose to do it. It would be a massive, bloody, ugly war, but the Israelis are certainly capable of doing it. And Hassan Nasrallah knows that, which is why his attacks have been limited in scope against Israel, and Israel's attacks have been limited in scope against him. Now, I know as much as you know about what happened over the last 24 hours where their messaging systems exploded simultaneously. That would tell you to watch who you buy your messaging systems from, I guess. Nonetheless, Nasrallah is not interested in getting into a fight with them, and Iran can't force him to do it, despite the fact that Lebanese Hezbollah is trained, equipped, and supported by Iran. So Iran, and what's interesting is what Iran and what Lebanese Hezbollah have not done. So now we go to the third, here are the true believers down in Yemen, the Houthis, the most radical of all the proxy groups, very aggressive. They came to power in Yemen in 2014, overthrew the government. Since then, they fought a bloody and successful war against Saudi Arabia and a bloody and successful war against UAE, both of which wanted to get rid of the Houthis, and they were unable to do so. The Houthis control a minority of the country, but the strategic part of the country, and they are basic to their literature is death to Israel, death to the United States. They're committed. They actually are true believers. Of all these proxies, they're the ones that really want to support Hamas. And here's the other thing. The Houthis are really, really good aeronautical engineers. They're good. They're good at it. So Iran ships weapons down to the Houthis, either by dhow, at sea, or across Oman. Not a lot, but some. The Houthis improve those weapons and employ them to great effect. But they can't produce enough to threaten Israel. They can get onesies and twosies up against Israel. You're not going to penetrate Israeli defenses with onesies and twosies. It's going to take an attack from somebody like LH to try to overwhelm Israeli defenses. So the Houthis got frustrated with that and said, look, we can't hurt Israel, but what we can do is we can attack shipping in the Bab el-Mandeb, the strait at the bottom of the Red Sea. If you control the Bab el-Mandeb, you control the Suez Canal. And the Houthis can control the Bab el-Mandeb. They control it by using those close-range ballistic missiles, by drones, by speedboats, by all kinds of a variety of things. And they've been very aggressive doing that. As a result, world commerce, unless you're Chinese flagged, has had to go around the Cape of Good Hope. It's taken the slack out of the global shipping economy. It's raised prices. And look, no nation can order its ships to go through there. The United States can't tell American ships, American merchant vessels to go through there. That's dictated by the insurers. It's actually market forces. And market forces won't bear the risk of going through the Bab el-Mandeb unless you're Chinese. So what we have decided, we've declared as the United States is, we said, as a matter of policy, because it's actually very important to us, we're not going to allow a critical global choke point to be closed. It has nothing to do with Israel. It has everything to do with the United States as a maritime nation. And the fact that if you allow this choke point to be closed, at some point in the future, you might allow another one to be closed. For example, the Strait of Taiwan, the Strait of Malacca, other places that are equally important to the United States. So we said we're going to open it, and we have failed to do that. We have failed in every way that you can define failure to do that. We have the capability to do it, but instead we keep billion-dollar warships in the southern Red Sea catching Houthi attacks. U.S. warships are not meant to catch, they're meant to pitch. You keep a carrier down there catching. Carriers aren't meant to catch, they're meant to pitch. We have the military capability to end this threat. You do it one of two ways. You inflict enough pain on the Houthis so they're deterred from doing it. Or if that doesn't work, you remove the capability completely. We have the military capability to do it. I would argue from my vantage point, we simply lack the political will to do it. As a result, the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, and China is increasingly taking up an increasing share of the world shipping market as a result of that. There's a lesson there, and it's a powerful lesson. Again, we talked a little bit about this. The military is a blunt force, but it can do certain things for you. You can't, and the point I would make, and I forgot to make it when we talked about it, it's my judgment that if you go against the Houthis, the risk of escalation against Iran is zero. Iran's not going to go to war over the Houthis. They're just not going to do that. Because you go back to Iran, and I'll close with this, the primary goal of Iranian foreign policy is regime survival. Iran will go to great lengths to protect what they view as a revolutionary regime, came in the 70s when they overthrew the Shah. The first duty of a revolutionary regime, as all revolutionaries know, is to preserve it, to ensure it gets passed to the next generation, and to export the revolution. They want to do that, and they will not do anything that hazards that. Number two and number three objectives of Iranian foreign policy are destruction of the state of Israel and ejection of the U.S. from the region. And they pursue those two goals. They will never pursue goal 2 and 3, though, to an extent that it threatens maintenance of goal number 1. And we should remember that when we think about Iranian policy.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.